2 episodes back, we had some fun at the expense of the terrible-looking Sonic the Hedgehog live-action movie trailer, which managed the impressive feat of looking bad even compared to everything else that's been done with Sonic the Hedgehog between 1997 and now. Basically. Seriously, it's kind of amazing how long this property has lasted based on 3 undeniably decent games almost 30 years ago and like 2 good cartoons, I think?
To act too soon could seal their fate.
Only to learn soon after that everyone else had apparently had so much fun at the expense of that trailer that the studio's feelings got hurt, and now they're apparently going to change the weirdly awful looking design of the CGI Sonic model to some degree that maybe people will like better, because that's probably the place where most of the changes can be made at this point now that they've already, made the movie.
Oh, come on.
Now, who knows what's actually going on here? Are they really bowing to fan pressure? Did they intentionally release a bad design so they could look good for fixing it later? Probably not. That's a lot of money to spend for a maybe, but who knows, I guess. Had there perhaps been long-standing differences of opinion on the production about what the final render should look like, and this gave one party over another something like a data point to go told you so with? Who knows? It's Hollywood. We still don't really know who killed the Black Dahlia, or what really happened with Fatty Arbuckle, or if my audience is getting these incredibly dated and unnecessarily dark Hollywood history references, yes. Anyway, what it boils down to is that now everyone working in effects on this movie will probably have to put in a bunch of unnecessary overtime hours they weren't planning on in order to fix something that probably should have been fixed before it got to the hard part on a compressed high-stress schedule. In other words, video game movies have now been infected with the most insidious workplace ailment in regular video games: crunch. AKA the baked-in, let's just assume having to nearly kill ourselves to make this game happen in the home stretch instead of just budgeting time realistically in the first place, bad management practice rampant in AAA game development for over a decade that's transformed the making-of story behind some of your favorite and least favorite games of the last few years into the Korean animation studio gag from the Clerks cartoon.
Korean animation studio! Everybody work! Everybody work! Everybody work! He big mean man whip us. We are slaves.
Now at this point, I don't even need to go down a list or even cite one particularly recent or infamous individual example. From Red Dead Redemption's 100-hour work weeks and Rockstar somehow thinking that they should brag about that, to Epic guilting its workers into foregoing weekends and time off for minor fixes, to Telltale literally grinding itself into extinction, to Riot jumping up like, man, we did all that shit too, and just wait till you hear about all the sexual harassment. And then we find out now that the same kind of stuff was going on at NetherRealm in Mortal Kombat, with over 100-hour days, pressure to overperform, and contractors getting underpaid, and also, evidently, they couldn't give any of those 100 extra hours to have Ronda Rousey do a second take on any of those line readings, because, wow, she's as bad at voice acting as she is at acting. Like, seriously, it's kinda weird to hire someone who's good at exactly one thing, and it's the thing you're gonna animate them doing instead of, like, having them actually do it.
You've been looking for me, Scarlet.
Anyway, crunch is often thought of largely in terms of a Western gaming problem, which is unfair and culturally biased, kind of, mainly because the same culture of overwork and masochistic supplication of self to company that Americans in particular at least know they're supposed to find somewhere between problematic and abhorrent is still largely woven into the collective psyche of Japanese workplace culture and software and otherwise. Just look at the way Nintendo fandom romanticizes Masahiro Sakurai's Sisyphean self-punishment in grinding out the Smash Bros. Series, and if you want to reassure yourself that it's not just a gaming problem in Japan and kick your nostalgia just right the fuck in the balls, go read some testimonials from people who've actually had to work under Hayao Miyazaki. Yeah. Man, it was great when we found out at least Mr. Rogers wasn't an asshole, right? But okay, if you don't understand why crunch and gaming's one-time romantic tech dev as gladiatorial combat and or actual warfare idealization thereof is bad, I assume it's because you didn't know crunch meant let's work desperate to be employed people almost to death on ludicrous schedules so it looks like we're meeting budgets better than we would be under ethical labor standards, and if you don't get that, what the hell is wrong with you? Obviously, this is something the games industry needs to stop letting be an acceptable part of its culture. But as to the question of why it's part of that culture in the first place, choice, I really do think it's mostly about the industry and the medium still having problems growing up and understanding whatever its new identity is going to be. The reason crunch mentality came about in the Western tech world is because so much of modern Silicon Valley was built up from a culture of upstart programmers and independent computer clubs who organically transferred the small indie garage business mentality of self-punishing grind work into the broader corporate structure without really realizing, or if we're being honest, caring all that much, that in doing so they were handing more cynical traditional corporate minds that both took over later and emerged among them an insidiously exploitable psychological tool. And anything that grows out of a giant-scale business desperately clinging to the affectation of scrappy youthful punk rock rebelliousness is going to get supercharged to absurd degrees in gaming, where that attitude has defined the entire culture for the last 2 decades and counting. In fact, when you get right down to it, almost every shitty thing that's played out in this business, from sexual harassment to insipid journalism infighting to online bullying campaigns to games themselves that pander to the ugliest impulses and corporate cultures that want to spend, earn, and move among million-dollar budgets like serious, legit media megastars, but then still run their offices like it's a rented loft full of insurgent underdog frat boys with a chip on their shoulder and something to prove, goes back to this attitude. This is not a complicated issue, or at least it shouldn't be. Hard work should be hard on the work, not on your physical or mental well-being. The world of gaming in 2019, even on the fringiest fringe of the indie scene, is not the killer-be-killed Wild West anymore. And while it's frankly the least important part of this, badly treated people are going to turn out badly made games. It's time we took the bite out of crunch. Just a thought. So this week, Activision laid off a shitload of people in a needlessly drawn-out, waiting-for-the-sword-to-fall fashion that really would have already been an absurdly ghoulish spectacle if it hadn't landed at the exact same time as an embarrassingly ignorant YouTube screed from a video games journalist whose industry relevance floats somewhere down around, well, mine, honestly, was getting spread around, blurting out hacky right-wing talking points, crapping all over, raising discussion points about one of the only things that could have helped those now imperiled Activision employees, and could still help others working in the nuclear hellscape that is the games industry: labor unions. Now, I should probably state my position out nice and clear right up front here. Organized labor works. Organized labor is good. Organized labor improves and saves lives. Organized labor is good for workers, good for consumers, and yes, good for companies. Unless said companies are predatory, dishonest, or societally destructive, in which case, f them. Now, you can go ahead and say that I'm only saying that because I'm a liberal, a leftist, or whatever. I don't subscribe to any particular label or care much about political philosophy outside of does it work or not. But frankly, the 20th and 21st century success of organized labor is so overwhelmingly self-evident. To be honest, for me it's a thing beyond the realm of theoretical political philosophizing and into plain old just observable fact, like it's right there for you to see with your eyes, like the earth being round, or the Pope being Catholic, or Bobby Kotick being an overpaid douchebag. Now, if we disagree on any of those things, it doesn't mean you and I have some kind of nuanced ideological schism going on. It just means you're stupid. The only remotely good arguments, and I stress very, very remotely, against a stronger, concerted push for organized labor in the games industry isn't that it's wrong or that it won't help, but that it's difficult. And that is, in fact, regrettably very true. Gaming is a unique medium comprising multiple disciplines across a unique hybrid industry situated at a nexus between the creative arts and tech sciences, and that's not even getting into the difficulties in organizing across international boundaries. Although that's a challenge that's increasingly facing the entirety of organized labor movement regardless of industry. But difficult does not mean impossible by any stretch of the imagination, and it's particularly galling in terms of a person cannot possibly be this stupid and also functional, therefore this must be bullshit, to hear it being seriously argued that the games industry doesn't need organized labor because Silicon Valley runs fine without it. Firstly, no it doesn't. From the warehouse all the way up to the superstar coders, big tech's daily grind is a goddamn dystopia of early burnout, high turnover, and workplace PTSD. And secondly, it runs, fine or not, in large part for the same ugly, awful reason big studio game dev by and large does. A thus far endlessly replenishing, fiercely competitive workforce of eager young people willing to endure abuse and degradation to work vaguely adjacent to something resembling their dream job, plus the ever-increasing reality that for many the alternative is move home to waste away in the decaying cultural wasteland of real America. Thirdly, It's not even really an accurate parallel, since the gaming industry is really only part of big tech by half, maybe even less than that, and as such can't be properly compared to Silicon Valley. Gaming is overwhelmingly a creative industry. It certainly views and presents itself as such. The Western games industry in particular has never been able to conceal its burning desire to become an equal of the American movie industry, to become Hollywood. For reference, see literally everything Activision in particular has developed, produced, or purchased over the last 20 goddamn years at least. And yet the one core component of the Hollywood system that the gaming business isn't eager to try and spit out a tacky Dorito-dusted pod person homunculus copy of is that Hollywood is a decidedly union town, one organized, however imperfectly, but organized all the same, not along whole industry lines or individual company lines, but along disciplinary lines. There's a writers guild, a screen actors guild, a directors guild, and that's to say nothing of the unionization of craft and tradespeople who do the building, electrical, catering, security, whatever. And that's the movie industry. So essentially less a business than a rotating grown-up Hunger Games of drama club geeks and cocaine sitting on top of a literal fault line. If organized labor can mostly work there, it can mostly work in video games. And even if it can't to the same degree, it's worth trying for as much as the game's labor force can get for it, if for no other reason than to put some fear of mortality into the likes of Activision, Electronic Arts, and the rest of the corporate bastards, and remind them that the games that make them rich do not develop themselves. Yeah, you're right. I should find the way to close by bringing it around to where it affects gamers and consumer advocacy, but honestly, if you say you love gaming, shouldn't you care about this stuff even if it doesn't directly affect you? It's just, I'm sorry, it's hard to look at hundreds of people getting laid off and still be thinking, what of the consumer?
Oh, won't somebody please think of the
Like, if you still have trouble grasping the personal salience of the phrase, check your privilege, and your first reaction to hearing about hundreds of people being out of work is, how will that affect my expensive electronic toys? That right there, that's your privilege. You should check on it. But that being the case, as I said up front, organized labor is also better for the consumer. Look, think about this logically. Do you really think there's no correlation between so many big games being drab, artless, uninnovative, generic, flavorless dreck, plagued by delays and yet still released broken and riddled with bugs, and game development being a horrible environment to work in with zero job security or incentive to do anything more than head down, just get by, punch the clock minimum? Would you be willing and able over time to commit the full force of your creative energy and passion to a company like Activision, knowing that it won't matter because at any moment the bosses can post record earnings and mass layoffs the same week? Does it not make basic common sense that if your game dev job was a good place to work, you will be more likely to produce good work there? That if game developers, designers, programmers, coders, etc. had unions and guilds and the protections they win watching their backs, they'd be able to focus their creativity and skills on the singular task of making the best games possible, precisely because they aren't constantly panicked by the distraction of impending potential job loss, homelessness, medical needs, who's going to feed their kids, their families, themselves. If gamers want a better games industry and better games, gamers should support the laborers who make those games and the organizing of that labor. Just a thought.